You know, this is a great story. I don't think there's any other story in this province of something put together by a government that is as happy a story, the story of colleges. That's my view, and I think you'll see how successful it has been. The enormous growth in colleges is remarkable. Now, here's what we want to do today. I don't want to spend too much time on history, only because I want to be able to get to the end where we talk about board practices as well, and maybe have a discussion. So if things are bothering you, we can say, well, this is our view. There's no perfect answer in any of these dividing line between governors and management, governors and president, chair, and there's nothing perfect in this area. A lot depends on the style of presidents and chairs. But what we do want to do is talk about the colleges, the role of the board, and the role and responsibilities of governors. And to answer that, I think we have to look at the history and the mandate that's been established by the government and the policy through policy directives. And I think then we have to talk about the best practices to be a governor. And I'd like as well to be able to say, here's what we're doing at Algonquin. I mean, how do we stack up against our responsibilities as laid out by governments? So let's take this then to, this is what we're talking about, some history, the board mandate, and best practices. A little bit of history. In 1945, the end of the war, enormous changes throughout Canada. Let's start with immigration. Immigration, 25,000 children per year 25,000 per year under the age of 18 came into the Ontario school system. An enormous number, emptying a good part of Europe, the Mediterranean basin, Eastern Europe, an enormous increase. Second thing that happened was 60,000, this is the extent of the baby boom, 60,000 annual births in 1938, the year before the war. In 1960, 160,000 births in Ontario. And in 1965, baby boomers, all these immigrant children were 19. What are they thinking about? I need a living. You have to get out, you have to make a living, you have to get married, you have to find a job. So you had this enormous, Bill Davis in his speech in May of 1965 said, we are engulfed by willing workers, people looking for work. And of course, unemployment insurance, the cost of unemployment insurance, this was a preoccupation of the 1950s in this country and the 1960s and 70s, less so today. At the same time, the war generated an enormous knowledge explosion. And a little feature that was very important, Mr. Davis, the Minister of Education, was in the riding of Brampton. And John Diefenbaker shut down the Avro Arrow. He had 14,000 workers, many of them in their 30s and 40s, looking for work. So he looks around, he said, what are we going to do? We have this enormous number of workers looking for jobs. We can't afford the services they need. What is available? Well, he said, let's look at universities. And he's quickly answered, not the right vehicle. Universities don't work. They're not career centers. They're not interested in it. They really are in mind and thought and not available for career development and job training. So he looked around and he found the model in California. And it was the technical college. We already had some vocational colleges, but they were really carpenters, plumbers, and that kind of. It was really part of the apprenticeship program for the trades. So he saw the problem. This is part of the Robarts government in the 1960s. Saw the problem and went out and set up colleges But here's the way he did it. He said in that same speech, it's an urgent problem. He spoke of a crisis. And so he did it through the Department of Education. So you can see what this means. It means it would be a college would be similar to primary and secondary school. But he started with that in 1965. The regulations came out in the same year, in late 1965, and there'd be no independence. The leaders of colleges would be principals, not unlike elementary and primary schools. The universities saw the expansion that was available, the money that would be available, so they wanted control. He made the decision, the Robarts government did, to not have universities in control of this new career training institution in the province. And because it was a department, the government really ran it and was responsible for it and was deeply involved in colleges. But a good idea cannot be kept unaddressed and unfelt and undeveloped. Immediately, Scarborough became the first. They set up Centennial College in 1966, and within 2 years of the legislation, we had 18 colleges. Today we have 24 colleges. We have 350,000 full and part-time students, in addition to continuing education. We graduate about 56,000 each year, and which is more colleges than universities, more students in colleges than in universities. An example, in 1975, after this program was in for some 8-9 years, 10% of Ontarians had college credentials. Today, 24%. It is so successful, this experience, this experiment or experience, so successful that today at Algonquin, about 20% are university graduates?
Ranges from 20 to 30%.
Isn't that amazing? In other words, you have your Bachelor of Arts, your Bachelor of Science, you can't get a job, you're not useful, you have nothing relevant to the market. So, colleges, it's a story, an enormous story of success. But I have to say that it was a little wishy-washy at the start. This is the kind of language in June 1966, still the Robarts government, 4 basic principles for new colleges. They were trying to define, what are these colleges? So they used expressions like total education. They have to be dedicated to the cultural aspirations and occupational needs of students. So the first 2 are really student-oriented ideas. They have to be needs of business. And it kind of, you're left wondering, are they struggling with this idea at the very outset of colleges and how they will develop and fit into the education of Ontarians? Well, by 2000, the growth had been enormous, and by 2000, colleges were authorized to issue degrees as of right in their own way, degrees similar to universities. This, for Nancy and Mike, this is probably the most important. You ought to memorize it. It's really that significant. 37 years after the introduction of colleges, colleges needed definition, clarification. What are they all about? Here you had universities that have law and medicine and MBAs and commerce and engineering. Well, these are career programs. They were stuck in there almost since the 1700s in Britain, so they stayed there because there was no other institution. And yet we had set up a career training institution. So we had to define, colleges going forward. So these are critical expressions, I think. It's career-oriented. Purpose is to find and keep employment. So find employment, train for employment, retrain to remain relevant. Meet the needs of employers. It's a competition, market-driven purpose. Needs of employers. Recognize changing work environment, the complexity of technology, of changes in our society. Recognize that. Be sensitive to that. Support economic and social development, local and diverse communities. Remember, we have to give positions in colleges. Cannot say no. Cannot say no. Not like universities where they play around and you applied too late and so on. Colleges are supposed to be accessible, and every student who wants to go to a college, who can manage and handle the course, is entitled to be in a college. There's an accessibility purpose in making a living. You have to have that accessibility as part of the feature. So that's critical. You'll notice what they've done. It's a new approach, an enormous reform. They became autonomous entities. They're now crown agencies, and you'll see this expression later. We're agents of the government. Market-driven, competitive, globalization, very much part of colleges. It's adopted corporate management structure, all of this in 2002, where we now have CEOs, presidents, vice presidents, no longer principals and bursars and registrars. Well, we have a registrar, and we're self-governing. So we now have a board of governors, and we are expected to run our own operation. Well, you can imagine what happened when the government realized it had created these 24 independent institutions. Just going back to to this, when you think as a governor of the, as you're measuring, assessing what comes to this table, this is the rule of what colleges are about. Just keep remembering this, and you justify it. You justify anything that comes to the table, you justify it, and you're right on, you're entirely right to raise questions if the program is career-oriented, finding, keeping employment, needs of employers, sensitive to the community and its needs, sensitive to changes in technology. That's critical. So that's the what rule, what colleges do. Colleges have this enormous independence. The government started to get a little nervous, and they say, well, if we're going to let them do this on their own, be self-governing, we've got to be a little careful. So the next few years, into 2003, they started to find control devices. And these control devices have gone right up into 2010, where they now appoint 4 members of the board. Well, these 5, remember, this is important because the minister says, I will intervene if the college is not well managed, does not properly apply financial resources, which means a budget and spending in accordance with the budget properly. Budgets of this college have to be approved by the minister. You can't just put together what you want. If the college doesn't grant access to students, and the government says, we want you to grant access, and we're telling you, Aboriginals, people with disability, all right, we don't think you've done enough. They don't put it quite in those terms, but they focus on the Aboriginal and disabled students, saying, grant access. You must deliver quality education, and you must lastly comply with our directives, government's directives. So, again, as a governor, remember the what rule. This is what colleges do. And how do you measure how colleges are doing? This is the how rule. They have to be well managed. They have to be within budgets. They have to grant access, quality programs, and comply with policy directives. On delivering quality programs, a statute expressly says, it's a very interesting matter because it really goes to management. But the statute says that's so important, we want the Board of Governors to approve cancellation of programs, new programs, suspension of programs. So management has to justify to this board whenever they want to cancel or have a new program. Now that's fascinating because that's management. That ought not to be at the board's level, but it is. And it's probably the largest exception to prove the importance of the quality of the programs. And in 2003, the colleges came under more and more direction from the government. The government in a regulation said, look, so everybody understands, sure, you have this autonomy, and we have a power to intervene, but we also have a power to appoint governors. If we have to appoint governors, we can get rid of governors. We want you to know, go ahead and do it, but if you're not doing it right, we have the power to appoint governors. We have a power, an overriding power to fill vacancies. We have a power to intervene. We've already talked of that. We have a power to appoint investigators. We'll send somebody in. If we feel that you're building something, you never got approval for it, you're borrowing and you never got proper approval, you held back information, we have a power to appoint investigators, to dismiss the board, put in our own board, and lastly, to put the college into trusteeship. So the government has these powers. We have our responsibilities as a board. The college has its responsibilities under particularly the 2002 Act of what it must do. Now, the 2002, so you know politically, McGuinty came in October 2003. 2002 legislation, this enormous reform, it had been in the works for a while, but it really came out of the Harris government. And that little guy who's around for a few days, it seems, Ernie Eves, was actually the minister who brought in the 2002 reform of colleges. And ever since then, the colleges have been, for the most part, independent, not-for-profit corporations, subject to the Corporations Act of Ontario. So if you go to the 2003 regulation, and Susanna could get that for anybody if anybody wants to have it in their records. The next thing I want to mention, McGuinty said, look, McGuinty was Mr. Education, you know that. So he sets up, the first thing he does really is to set up the Ray Commission. So Ray worked extremely hard. It's one of the fastest reports. February, he came in October 2003, and within about 17 months, he had his report. He called for a significant increase in core funding of $1.5 billion in 2 years. October of the same year, McGuinty pledged 6.5, did I say million? Billion, 6.5 billion in 5 years, 5-year program. And so the money was starting to go into colleges to reflect their importance. And Ray required access to Aboriginals, not required, but he recommended that there be more done with Aboriginals, more done coordinating with high schools so that, in Quebec, they have a very neat system. Our system is quite different. In Quebec, every student goes through the college. It's so they get a sense, do I want to be a technician or do I want a degree in fine arts, something like that. Every student goes through that. We don't. We have parallel systems. So if you get locked in the wrong side, it's rather regrettable because you could have 3 years, you have a wasted life almost because it's parallel. In Quebec, it's serial. They move through, every student moves through a college where they're introduced to the technician sort of stuff. And he called for a multi-year plan of action. It resulted directly in the multi-year accountability agreement. And we'll talk about that shortly. We've already talked about these. I've just listed them. They come right out of the what rules in the 2002 Act. part of the 2002 Act. We're into the mandate now of the boards. So we're going to get into some detail here for especially the new governors. And this is the performance requirements, that they have strong management, sound financial management, accessibility to students, high quality. So these are the so-called how rules. I refer to them as the how. This is how colleges have to operate in performing the what they have to do. Now, some interesting details. That number of governors, Algonquin has 17. You should know that external governors, the legislation says you can have a minimum of 12, maximum of 20. Algonquin is fixed, it's at 12, and you wouldn't want more, I think. It's a great size. An external governor may not be either a student of this college nor an employee of this college. There's no reference here to a spouse or a child being an employee. It's really the external governor directly. And in October 2010, I sense the government was feeling that, and I think it may have had something to do because they were complaining about the compensation of presidents and mainly presidents. They said, look, there seems to be no control in this area. They wanted the government to appoint 4 governors. I think that's where it came from. They never quite told you, but they did want to be more involved because they said, look, government will appoint from now on, since 2010, 4 governors. Internal, 4 constituency representatives, and they're there. They're listed for your understanding. The president is not only a member of the board, but a voting member of the board. Doesn't have a casting vote or anything like that, but the president as a right, legislated right, is a member of the board. So when you add them up, you have 12 and 4 and 1 more, 17. The term is 3 years plus 1 renewal. Your term starts September 1, and that's for all governors. The quorum is 10 for us. It's a majority is 17, 9, plus 1 is 10, and you must have that majority in place for all decisions. You can have fewer if you just want to talk about something, but if you're going to make a decision, you have to count and know you have 10. Board meetings, all meetings are open except for personal matters, confidential matters, and the Act says you must set those out in your bylaw. You have to identify them because, again, the government approves bylaws.
So in practice.
And in camera for confidential matters, and we've identified at this college the confidential matters which this college has identified. There are 4. There is a general category of matters which by their nature are confidential, and the chair makes that decision. But there are 4 identified: individual personnel matters, strategic labor relations, real or personal property matters, and by that delete matters and think of transactions. If you're negotiating to sell, or in our case, we're negotiating to sell the Lee's campus, that's a confidential matter. And litigation. So those are the 4. And if it's confidential, the chair would typically say this is a closed meeting, and before we go further, are there any conflicts? And the chair makes a decision. A chair can be overridden by the members if there's a perceived conflict, but by the members of the board that are remaining. But just know that the chair essentially makes that decision, and you move through to, if it's a closed meeting, in-camera meeting, then anyone with a conflict has to leave the meeting. If it's an open meeting, you may stay in the meeting, but you may not participate, talk, or vote. College budgets. You must have a balanced budget. Dwayne knows that awfully well, and every year he brings a balanced budget. And that means you got to live within that budget. Because if you don't, and a deficit threatens, they don't say a deficit of $1 million, a deficit of $1 threatens. If it threatens, and it's real, then you have to notify the minister that you're looking at a deficit this year. You probably can't be avoided. And the second part of your notification, you have to put forward a recovery plan, a 2-year deficit elimination plan. So it's a serious matter. Know as well, Section 28 of the Financial Administration Act says no liabilities or commitments may be entered into that are not set out in the budget. So there's a requirement. All liabilities and commitments must be identified in the budget, which, as I said, gets approved by the government. So that's Section 28. You cannot operate outside of the budget or say, well, we budgeted that, let's just slide that money over here as long as we don't go into a deficit. You're not allowed under the Financial Administration Act, and all Crown agencies are subject to that. The next point is the accountability measures. And some of this, came out of the Ray Commission. There are 3 mandatory plans. Every year we have a strategic plan, we look at it, and we measure and assess how we're doing in terms of this 3-year strategic plan. Secondly, we have the business plan. The business plan is the budget, and it's done annually. And then thirdly are the annual reports, audited financial statements. So we have 3 accountability. All of them are given to the government. They're all public open documents. The act, the regulation as well in 2003 says colleges must use accountability tools. That is how we manage the college. And so key performance indicators, the KPIs, are identified in that regulation of 2003, and there are essentially 3. You can have more, but you must have these 3 because the regulation requires. Graduates and employment. How well do our graduates fare in getting jobs? What's the lag period? What percentage get jobs? How long? What jobs? Secondly, graduation, and you'll hear a great deal more of KPIs later. Graduation rate, retention rate. How many come in, how many leave, how many graduate. KPI. Student satisfaction is probably the only one that's really subjective. You ask the students how satisfied they are with programs, with management, student services, all sorts of things, programs. And then the last one, which did come in through the Ray Commission, is accountability agreements. They say, put together your plan and you show it to us, the government says, and now we're going to make you accountable for that plan. And Doug, I think, will be talking about that a little later today as well. Now, conflicts. Obviously, you cannot have a conflict, and we talk about it. These are quotes that are set out in the statutes and regulations of the government. Essentially, the highest standard is imposed on us that would bear the closest public scrutiny. So this is what you would face if there was a conflict and you did not comply. What is a conflicting interest? Just fasten on the word influence. Don't think of reasonable. Don't say, well, what would a reasonably well-informed, forget about that. If you know, and usually you know these things in the stomach before you know them in the head, influence is something that's happening likely to influence my decision. A student, fee increase, clearly. Faculty representative at this table on program changes, especially if it's in his or her department, clearly. I had a little one on the property thing where we acted for the University of Ottawa that bought the Lees campus. So you say, I have a conflict, but I think I made a mistake because I don't think I left the meeting. That's a confidential in-camera matter, which I now know I should have left the meeting. And perhaps I did, I can't remember now, but because you should not know what the governors are saying about the price, et cetera, et cetera. You shouldn't hear it. So fasten on the word influence, and you sense that, and it's a personal responsibility. What turns on it? Failure to declare at the bottom. If you don't declare and it's discovered, and these things usually are discovered, someone calls the chair and says, do you know? And anyway, there's oral reprimand, written reprimand, request resignation, and lastly, removal. And the chair makes that decision to remove a governor. That is the chair acting alone. It's enough to say that if conflicts ever come up, just keep these slides available, because I think when do you declare? Earliest opportunity. As soon as a matter comes up, point of order, Mr. Chair, I believe I have a conflict in the matter. You don't say what it is, because that's often a matter of some confidence yourself. So I think I have, thank you. You may confide in the chair what it's about privately, but the earliest opportunity at the outset of the meeting, if it's something said to you and you know it'll be dealt with at the meeting, or when it comes up otherwise, an actual conflict and perceived or potential conflict, enough to say an actual conflict is a clear conflict that anyone would say, such as a student fee increase, and so on, that kind of thing. Myself, those are actual conflicts, well known in law. Perceived or potential conflict, if your spouse is on a board of someone that might tender, you say to the chair, can I speak to you because I'm not sure this is a conflict. I have a spouse who's on the board over here that they're dealing with a tender. I know Microsoft was bidding for work here, and I remember Mike, stood aside. Bank of Montreal was bidding for the investment account here for the foundation, and David Wallace stood aside. So if it gets to perceived or potential, then the board determines by majority of vote whether or not the member should leave. If there's a conflict and it's discovered, you remove that governor and you reconsider and re-vote. Now we get into these government directives, and these can come out at any time, and I've given these sort of names because I kind of like, they really excite the purpose of this board and of governors. It's rich language. The first and foremost rule, the priority rule, is the college. Not the college system, your college. First and foremost, that's what you must have in mind. You can debate issues as a representative, but when you vote, you're not a constituent. I'd like to think as a constituent, faculty, support, whatever, I'd like to think they would coincide. They ought to. But if they don't, you must vote in the best interests of the college. It's made clear. The government has said you must comply, this board must comply with this directive. Not as a member of any particular constituency. The first and foremost rule is the best interests of the college. I call this one the, you call it whatever you want, the accountability, but it's a neat one because it makes us accountable to Ontarians. Kind of interesting. We are, because once you become accountable to the public, there's a trust relationship that's almost automatic conceptually. It really raises, I think, the obligations we have. What are you accountable for? Well, the successful achievement of the college's mandate. That's your Section 202, your 202 Act, rather. That's what, I mean, they might imagine they have other mandates, but that's the mandate. That's what the government says this college is all about. In view of the financial support, that's the reason. The government finances us. I don't think they need a reason, frankly. They make laws. But perhaps because it comes through a government directive, they try to add a little bit because it's not law. It's government direction. Not unlike in tax law where you have bulletins and so on. Government's telling you, look, this is the way we will approach this. So there is a trust relationship between governors and Ontarians. So perhaps the public accountability, just remember Ontarian accountability rule, it raises it, I think, a bit. The first rule of good governance is this. And good governance requires that. I want you to focus on policies, processes, and structures. That's what we're about. We delegate. We're governors. Now, governor, the king governs, the prime minister manages. We govern. We tell the college, and essentially the government has already told us, these are the objects. This is what your college must be doing. We have to make sure that the policies, processes, and structures are in place and are consistent with the government's, the legislation of the province. The fact they've said to promote effective operation, the word effective means, well, maybe I can roll up my sleeves, and if it's going to be effective, I'm going to tell the president how to do it. Well, going too far. It's more generic. It's that the policies are there to effectively operate towards the goals that the province has set for this college. So it fulfills its mandate. So you have the 2002 Act for the what rules. You have the how to perform rules, which essentially are we'll intervene if you don't do this. All right, so remember those. And just always measure whatever's happening at this table in terms of the what and the how rules. And always remember as well that we're here to look at policies. Do you have the budget? Have you, tell me about the budget process. I've got to know that. Because I have to know whether or not you have the process in place to make it a meaningful budget. So, processes, policies, and structures. We'll talk shortly about this tension between governors and president, or governors and management. Just probably an appropriate place to say we delegate to the president. We don't delegate to vice presidents. The president is the person to whom we delegate the management of the. Now you can say, well, don't we really delegate management team? Well, I think when they talk about the lines of communication, and we'll talk about that shortly, I think it is board. We speak through the chair speaks to the president, and then we sit and we watch how the president follows these. This is our policy. This is what we must do. What are you doing about Aboriginals? The government has said you must do this. It's not for you to say it's difficult to do. That's not your choice. We are here to govern, and you must do that. So, we'll talk about that shortly. But always try to remember that mandate that set out the section, the 2002 Act, which is actually Section 2 of that Act, and which sets out all the what rules. The next is and you see how these kind of overlap, but they're good. They're good. They're helpful. The government says when you're studying this board, these, by the way, these policy directives are on governance and accountability, and so they're really to the governors, but they're also to the board. I mean, the board obviously knows all of this, and management knows all of this. When you're assessing it, keep in mind these 5 tests. Firstly, The college has to have organizational integrity. Well, they don't tell you what that means, but you and I know what that means. That means that they have vice presidents with all of their areas clearly identified. There are lines of communication. They report. They have evaluations of performance. All of that is part of the integrity of the management. Now, in our case, and they have different arrangements at other colleges, in our case, we have 6 vice presidents. I assume we still have our 6. Do we have more? We have academic, human resources, student services, administration, business development. I don't know if they're all filled or it's under, yeah. So this is part of self-governing. You can change this. And we've also have an executive director of advancement, sort of an extra, and I suppose very much part of the management team as well, Doug Weatherspoon. So that's our design. That's the management team. But when we delegate, we hire the CEO. We don't hire vice presidents. We don't say to Kent, it's not our job, say, Kent, I don't think Claude really is the right guy for, none of our business really. But we can say, the way you bring programs to this board is entirely deficient. Okay, we're allowed to say that. We're allowed to say, if it is entirely deficient, you have to be careful. You have to be respectful. You have to be well informed. You have to know how they've done the processes to arrive at their decisions. But understand the difference between governing and managing, and understand as well these 5 tests of a president's management. And it goes directly into the assessment, the evaluation of the president, choosing or deciding on salary, deciding on contract extension. These are the 5. Organizational integrity, financial management, their budgets, they do it well. He's put the right person in, communicates well with stakeholders, essentially government, governors, faculty. You can identify it's not a closed circle of stakeholders. Collects and reports information. We talked about the mandatory reports. All of that's properly done, well done, good solid processes, and generally good management practices. Next point is the board. The board has standards as well. We don't sit there and tell management what to do. We also have to do stuff. Firstly, we're authorized to govern. We're accountable earlier to Ontarians. We're accountable as well as governors to students, employers, and communities. Bear in mind the president's accountable to the board. No doubt of that. The president might feel he or she is accountable to students and so on, and that's a nice thing perhaps, but not in law. The president is accountable to the board. It's the board that is accountable to the Ontarians, to the students, to the objects of legislation, and so on. The board has a very important responsibility. For what purpose? Well, again, to achieve the established mandate. So that is the authority to govern the college. The authority to govern the college, to put in place a vision, put in place a strategic plan. We have to approve that. We change it. We add to it. So we've done that. We've done that at this college. This is the agency, the Crown agency rule. And the nature of Crown agencies is that the government has set them up because it's the, usually in a management sense, but it's the easiest way to carry out public responsibilities, public activities. So as you know, the post office, and there's so many CBC, there's so many examples of, but in education, colleges, universities, and healthcare, hospitals, each of those is a Crown agency. And as such, they're accountable to the broader public and the government. They act as the taxpayer's agent. I don't know why they don't say the government's agent, more the government. We're not agents of taxpayers. They don't tell us what to do. But we are accountable enough to say we're accountable, and we're accountable for the college, its actions, its achievement of goals, its compliance with government priorities, its management. So you can see how kind of vague a lot of this is, but it's enough to say there's a very high responsibility, Michael and Nancy, very high as a governor, in my mind, very, very high. And it's a noble responsibility, because it's the education, it's making a living for the Ontarians. I think it's a very important responsibility. Now, I call these the marching orders. The government has said, at a minimum, boards, not colleges, okay? At a minimum, boards, the government wants to see a governance structure, something that works. So we've worked at that. We have a chair and a vice chair, and they have responsibilities. They know what those are. Each knows what his or hers is. We have an audit committee, governance committee. We said a few years ago, let's get a vision. In other words, we have an executive committee, and the executive committee, if you're dealing with a president's evaluation, it has to be an external governor. Just think about it. You're deemed to be in conflict. An internal is deemed to be in conflict in the evaluation of a president. So we have an executive committee, which also usually deals with, salary increases and so on. The extension of a contract, that committee simply makes a recommendation to the board. But again, without the internal governors there, typically, because they're in a conflict. You may let them stay in. You may not declare it if that's what you want to do. You may not declare it as confidential, because it's not evaluation of a president. It's essentially the renewal of a president's contract. But the evaluation of a president is what is the conflict, and defined as a conflict. So we have to have the governance structure in place, and I think we do. You have to ensure the governance structure has clear lines of communication. So what does that mean? And internal accountability. Well, it means the audit committee chair is given a responsibility on all important events during the year to report to the board. That chair has to make sure that's done. Why? Because there have to be clear lines of communication. Same is true with governance committee. You can't just set up committees and say, look, we're not going to give you a place on our agenda. There have to be clear lines of communication. Internal accountability, you can define this as you perhaps would want to, but I think it means that each governor is accountable to each other governor for their responsibilities. That is to say, to be well informed, to be well prepared at meetings. I think that's what internal accountability means, to be responsible for your duties as a governor. At a minimum, this board has to set the college vision, change it if it needs it, set the strategic directions and overall goals and outcomes. The outcomes are the multi-year accountability agreement. We're back to those. That's an outcome agreement. Say what you're going to do, measure your progress to doing that. These are the 7 marching orders. Those are 3. What else? This is the most important, the most direct, the most easily understood responsibility. We hire the president. We delegate to the president. We monitor and evaluate how well the president attains the objects set out in the act and the policy directives of the government. That's the most difficult of all our responsibilities, probably the highest. If you do that well, all the others fall into place and are almost irrelevant. If you do that really well, I think the others approve a business plan, budget, and annual report. We have to approve the business plan, that is the budget, the annual reports. We have to assess regularly the president's performance. And we have to assess regularly the effectiveness of the board. All of this is set out in this directive. How effective? We can't just carry on saying, well, we're doing we're doing pretty well. We've got a good president in. No, we have to say, keep looking at ourselves, keep measuring and evaluating how well we're doing as a board. And lastly, take corrective action when you see there's a problem. That obviously includes dismissing a president, obviously, a most serious matter in any public organization. But that's the extent of our authority. Now, how are we doing? How's Algonquin doing? Well, I think very well. I think very well. And you can just quickly go down those. We have all of those in place. I won't repeat them. They're all there. They're easily seen. So, Nancy and Michael, you can see, this is the way, certainly when I put this together, and I think it's still correct, but the audit committee of 4 external, chair and president. President in the audit committee is non-voting. In the audit committee, executive committee, and so on. But we have all of those in place. Some of them, interestingly, have only been put in place in the last few years. Regular retreats, about 10 years ago, that started. Perhaps a little longer than that now, but not much. Regular retreats. Code of Ethics and Agreement was about 3 or 4 years ago. 3 years ago. Now, just remember here as well, in terms of negligence, it's suffice to say the law has been pretty clear that your obligation, the standard of performance, and I quote here, is to act honestly in good faith with the skill and diligence of, and this is the important part, a reasonably prudent person, not a reasonably prudent governor. All right, a reasonably prudent person in good faith with the skills and diligence. They're not expecting you to be competent, but they're expecting you to be diligent, get informed. The skill and diligence of a reasonably prudent person, and that's always clearly a question of fact. Let me just say this about that. There's a summary of literature. You can add, you've seen this. I would focus on let's just review them briefly. Focus on policies. The law is clear. Directors and governors must focus on policies, processes, and structures. Are they in place? How well in place? That's your focus, not on individuals, not how well they're doing, except for the person to whom you've delegated responsibility for management. That's the only person that we're able to say, look, we're going to evaluate the president annually. It's clear. You don't get into evaluating. You may get into evaluating programs occasionally. That's fine, only so far as you're trying to measure the effectiveness of processes and policies. Know the difference between governance, the authority to govern, and management. The healthy tension, literature says there should be a healthy tension. And if there isn't, then one or both sides is not doing their work. It's the nature of our responsibility. There is a tension between the Queen and the Prime Minister, whether you like it or not. Has the Prime Minister interfered? Has Prince Charles interfered? These issues come up all the time. There is a line. There is a line. And that line... But enough to say that you'll be sitting and listening, and then you'll hear a governor make a comment, and quickly you'll say to yourself, that's management. That's, that you've spent unwisely hiring Bob Shirelli. I heard that, I remember at the board. Well, that's management. If Bob Gillett felt that Bob Shirelli was a good person to hire to help in the process of our beautiful building, that's management. That's not our job. So don't get into that. But if he's not, if he can't, if you feel that it's really, and if we started to do badly, if Kent starts running up deficits, believe me, the word govern starts to mean something different. Okay, all right. It's not a static meaning. If it's not well managed, it starts to mean something else. You don't step into the breach. What you do is you sit down, you work out a plan of better management. We can't live with budget deficits. We can't, we can't have firings. You try not to interfere. But Nancy, your point earlier, during the labor strikes in college system, all governors were getting emails, not a lot, but they're trying to influence, they're trying to stir up, and David Wallace, who was chair at the time, got lots of phone calls, and so they try, and there's nothing wrong with that in my view, but the wise person simply knows what's going on and doesn't interfere. The literature talks about overseeing. Our fundamental responsibility is to oversee the direction and management. To oversee, not to do it, but to oversee. And they go on, and there should be quotations around, look over the CEO's shoulder, to look over the shoulder. You start whispering in the ear and saying, then I think you're probably interfering. There's a nice line there, and as long as it's being well run, you don't worry about that line. Your own responsibilities, I've often, again, the literature makes it clear. This literature comes from numerous cases over 200-300 years of history in Britain and Canada. And it says directors and governors, it's mainly in the directors, knowledgeable and well-informed, get knowledgeable, get well-informed, fair, principled, and respectful, and constructive. They mean something. They're vague, but they mean something. And then lastly, the standard of care. And I would add, because it's so critically important, I think, the 7 marching orders. I think they're just critical. Now, the very last one is just to make you aware of 2 bodies that exist in this province. And I may not have correctly identified them. It's my understanding. The College Employer Council. Now, I sat on the Governors Review Committee. The College Employer Council is actually set up by statute. It is a public body, a statutory body, presidents and board chairs, and the Governors Review Committee, it studies compensation. It also has the VP's compensation, and we make recommendations through the Governors Review Committee. I don't know if they still do that, but we did when I sat on it. So that is the first item is a statutory body. The second one is advocacy and lobbying. Now, when Kent mentioned COP, the Council of Presidents, that's not the statutory body. That's essentially the president saying, look, we're in this together. We have this team over here negotiating for colleges. So that is done through Colleges Ontario. Most of the negotiating was done through Colleges Ontario. The statutory body is essentially a research arm of the college system at the provincial level. Colleges Ontario is not statutory. It's an advocacy and lobbying group, and it's essentially the Council of Presidents. And they do have as well, or used to have, a Governor's Affairs Committee, of which I know that Mike was a member. And that, good governors and friends, is the presentation. Thank you.